Hello, my name is Leslie Berger, and I would like to welcome you to this episode of Renew. Renew is a show about the College of Forest Resources at Mississippi State University. In the College of Forest Resources, we work to conserve and preserve and use our natural resources wisely and sustainably. Today's show is going to feature one of the three units within the college, the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture, and here representing that unit is Dr. James Heilman and his graduate student, James Helfrich. So thank you for joining us today.
Our pleasure.
Excited to hear a little bit more about your work. You came in during COVID, so
right.
we actually even haven't had that much chance to visit with one another, even though that we work on the same floor.
That's right, yeah. I came in August of 2020, right at the onset of the pandemic, so it was pretty quiet for the first year.
Right, but I do remember one of the things that I found so interesting during your interview for the position was that you actually had done some work in Guam.
That's right.
Which is not something that most people think about even as being like a work site.
Yeah, that was an interesting experience. I was employed with USGS for just under 3 years, and so I was working through Fort Collins Science Center, but my duty station was Guam, and it was a interesting experience. 30-mile Long Island, so it feels very small, very fast. But I was there to work with the brown tree snake, which of course is in most textbooks now related to the sort of cascading effects that invasive species can have, and most of the native forest birds are no longer on Guam because of that. So part of my work was tasked with trying to figure out ways to suppress brown tree snakes with the ultimate goal of reintroducing some of the locally extirpated bird species.
Mm-hmm. And so how was that effort?
We're making progress. I mean, we're still a little ways out, but I think probably for the first time in the history that we've been working on this, that USGS and collaborators USDA have been working with this species, that we've got a real changes in the near future here. We are now using tools for landscape suppression that seem to be working. Mm-hmm. They may need to be augmented with other methods, but the idea of bird reintroductions they're coming. Right. So I think we are just probably a couple of years out now at this point.
Well, that's really amazing to think about how detrimental that species has been to the native fauna that was on that island. Yeah. Is just devastating. And that's what we see repeated actually in many, many cases when animals that aren't supposed to be in that environment are introduced, whether on purpose or accidentally. The local species just aren't ready to handle that, and so there are some consequences.
Yeah, and in this case, just devastating consequences, right?
And you can't put the animals back in the island until you get those snakes under control.
That's right.
So you're doing snake work still here, but not on Guam. Now
yes.
that you're here, Mississippi State, what are you doing with snakes here?
That's right. So before I started working with invasive species, I was working with snakes prior to that, but it was more on the opposite end of the spectrum, working with threatened and endangered species. And so a big part of the work that I've been involved with for, over a decade now is with the Eastern Massasauga. Through the Eastern Massasauga Species Survival Plan. This is a large collaborative effort that involves a nonprofit, the Edward Lowe Foundation. This is in southwestern Michigan, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources of Michigan, and about 20 odd accredited zoos across the country. And part of this effort is, it actually started during my dissertation, prior to the species being listed. And so we needed to identify a number of factors related to their population parameters. Mm-hmm. That is, what are their survival rates? How well are they doing here? Is management working? It is a wetland species, and so one of the threats, in addition to, of course, urbanization, conversion to agriculture, habitat fragmentation, another one that sometimes is not thought about is simply succession. Mm-hmm. And so it requires active management, and part of that active management plan is prescribed fire. And so early on in my dissertation, one of the things that the Edward Lowe Foundation was very interested in learning is, how is their management, prescribed fire management, working? Is it helping or hurting the species?
Sure.
And the result of that work showed that actually what they were doing seemed to be helping quite a bit. And we continue to monitor this population now. We're well over a decade. And so we're able to start getting to population growth and how this population is changing over time as a consequence of the management, because it's a long-lived species. So of course, you can't do it in 1 or 2 years and figure this out. And so it's this really wonderful collaborative work that allows all of these different parts and different invested interests to come together for the ultimate same goal.
Right. So James, you're part of this effort somehow, some way. So explain what your project is here as a graduate student in the College of Forest Resources.
Yeah, so I came on with Dr. Heilman, and so I'm working with that same species, Eastern Massasauga. And my real project is we got 2 major threats as relates to species. So we're working at climate change, and we're looking at habitat loss, which Dr. Heilman kind of alluded to. So one of my first projects is when you think about climate change, the fact that these snakes are ectotherm species where a lot of their body functions and life history is affected by temperature and climate.
Sure.
We're going to see, well, how will changes in climate over the next 60 years that we're predicting now is going to affect them, and what's that's going to do to their body size, to their growth, and to their life history. So we're taking a range-wide approach. So the East Massasauga Range is from about southern Illinois up to mid-Ontario, Canada, and then from about Wisconsin over to central New York. So I'm working with collaborators that are sending me growth data from all these different sites. I'm going to put that into models to look at how that is being influenced by the climate at each of those sites. And so if we can see, for example, that temperature is making them grow faster and be smaller, then we can look at future variables, right, in the future climate at each of those sites and predict where they're going to be, what their body size is going to be in 60 years potentially, or what their growth rate is going to be in 60 years, and how that's going to affect how many young they can have a year.
Right.
And my other project working with Habitat is working at the Edward O. Foundation at that specific site from the data that was collected while you've been working there. And we're looking at, normally when you think about figuring out how they use habitat throughout the year, a lot of times that's using tracking individuals. Instead of tracking individuals, we're looking at a way to survey the whole population and just see how the density of that population moves across the landscape. And if their density is in different places, and if that's correlated with their phenology. So like when they come out of hibernation, when they breed, when they give birth, when they go back into hibernation. If we can use that to kind of come up with best management practices, how to manage specific populations.
Right. So you brought some pictures actually, and one of the pictures is really interesting, and we'll get to that in just a moment because you got a picture of fire and water, and that seems very counterintuitive. But as we show these pictures, would you mind explaining what we're seeing in those?
Sure, happy to. So this is a group photo from last year. This is at the Edward Lowe Foundation, and this is our team of volunteers and representatives that help with our surveys. This is a blitz approach. We basically come out there for 1 week every year. So we've got representatives from several zoos, from Department of Natural Resources, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And then after this, we've got some images of prescribed fire. This is actually, so Eastern Massasaugas, because they occur in wetlands, encroachment of woody vegetation naturally pushes out wetlands, and so it could start to grow into a forest. And part of the management is because a huge part of Eastern Massasauga and ectotherms in general, their life history is associated with open areas.
Sure.
And so they need these open areas to thermoregulate, and so that prescribed fire then comes into play in managing that area to make it sustainable.
Right, keeps that area open. Okay, so we're talking about Eastern Massasauga, which is a really interesting snake. So we have some pictures to show those too. And so, yeah, what is this? Why is there a big blob of snakes all in this photo?
So in part of determining what we understood and what we needed to know and what we already knew was basically pulling animals into captivity for captive parturition. So that is, we would essentially keep pregnant females in the lab and then release them with their litters off after they were born, with the idea that we can then look at things like litter size, what is their reproductive frequency, what are the survival rates of these neonates, and so that part of that is a big piece of that. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of folks in Michigan that don't even realize that they have a rattlesnake in their home state. And this is a rattlesnake, but they are rather timid, docile. One thing I didn't mention earlier is in addition to the other threats that we talked about, why their numbers have been reduced, there was also a bounty for rattlesnakes in most states that they occurred.
Right.
And so part of our work is also changing perspectives of folks, right? Understanding that rattlesnakes are an important part of the ecosystem. If you don't like Lyme disease, you probably should like having snakes around, right? Because they feed on one of those vectors. Of course, this being small mammal populations.
Sure. So why earlier, just a second, we noticed that their tails were blue and red, and so this is an adult here in this photo.
Yeah,
y'all dyeing their tails?
Yes, so we are marking and tracking these populations over time. So this includes if they're neonates, that is very young individuals, we're maybe branding the underside of their belly. Once they get a little bit older, we convert that to what's a passive integrated transponder, a little microchip, same thing you'd have in your dog or your cat to identify the animal. And then once we release them, we will paint the rattle so that way we don't re-encounter that same individual. So if we see them the next day, we'll leave them alone.
Don't catch them a second time.
Right.
So how do you handle a rattlesnake to paint its tail?
Good question, very carefully. So we use a number of tools for the trade. And so part of that is we have tongs that we use in the field, and that's to catch them with, basically a grabber. But once we bring them to the lab, we have transparent PVC tubes, and we use this to gently restrain them, to keep them safe as well as us safe, so we can draw blood, take measurements, weigh them, and things like that. So.
Very interesting. So I have to ask you, James, why snakes?
Well, that's a very good question. So I really think I've always really liked the idea of working with these snakes. And I'm very lucky I actually didn't get the chance to work with snakes before meeting Dr. Hyman and coming down here. So I'm really interested in the problem solving of the conservation, maybe more so than the animal itself. But I think this area with these reptiles in this particular endangered species is really fascinating. I think it has a lot of potential to answer and be involved in some really cool questions.
So where do you see yourself going? We have just a moment left here, but after you finish this degree, where are you going to go next?
Yes, I definitely have a couple options. I'd be really interested in continuing this research, maybe going on to pursue a higher degree. Or I do really enjoy field work in working with management agencies. So I'd definitely be interested in going that route as well.
Right, well, maybe you can come back and work with one of the agencies that Dr. Heilman had worked with before. On the other end of the spectrum, from conservation to eradication of problem species.
That's right.
Maybe you'll be done on Guam and we won't have to go back there and do that. We can focus on endangered species instead of removal of invasive species.
There you go.
Well, I appreciate y'all coming and sharing your work, and I hope those that get to see this show will actually maybe come away with a little stronger appreciation for a critically endangered species. Many would argue that there is no good snake but a dead snake, right? But they do have an important role in the ecosystem, even if we can't see it directly. There are things like you mentioned, like Lyme disease, where they're important in maintaining those pest species that cause diseases and crops damage and stuff like that. So thank you for coming. For the rest of you, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the research that's happening in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture and some of the broader conservation work that's happening within the College of Forest Resources. Until we meet again, I encourage you to get out there and enjoy the resources we have around us. I've been your host, Leslie Berger.